in every relationship, there are always masks. Some masks are easy to recognize: social politeness, peacekeeping smiles, carefully chosen words meant to avoid hurting anyone. But there are also masks far more subtle, so subtle that even the person wearing them may no longer notice. And ironically, in many cases, the empath is the one wearing the largest mask. They listen more, understand more deeply, show greater compassion, and forgive more often than anyone else. From the outside, they seem like the strongest people in the emotional world. But pause for a moment and ask yourself, what happens when the empath stops forgiving unconditionally? What happens if they are no longer easily manipulated by guilt or half-hearted apologies? And what happens when they no longer play the role of the one who always understands in every conflict? Stay with this video until the end. What you are about to discover may help you see yourself in a new light, and perhaps, for the first time, understand why the moment an empath stops forgiving can change the entire world around them. 1. The truth about how empath abilities are formed. Many people look at empaths and believe they have been gifted with a special ability, the ability to read emotions, understand what others have not yet spoken, and sense the atmosphere of a room within seconds. But when we observe more deeply, we begin to see another story, quieter, more complex. Behind that sensitivity are often years of growing up in emotionally unstable environments, where anger could erupt unexpectedly, where silence could feel as heavy as an approaching storm, or where love was given inconsistently. In such environments, a child does not have many choices. They cannot control the world around them, but they can learn to observe it very carefully. The look in a parent's eyes, the rise and fall of a voice, the way a door is closed, the rhythm of breathing in a room. Each small signal gradually becomes important data. Over time, the child learns to sense subtle emotional shifts before they fully appear. This is not magic. It is a survival response. The depth psychologist Carl Jung once offered a powerful insight. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When we read this in the context of empathic individuals, another layer of meaning appears. The emotional awareness many empaths take pride in may not be entirely a conscious choice. It may be the trace of a past in which understanding others was the only way to feel safe. Yet there is something important that many people do not realize. What we often call deep empathy may sometimes be only the surface of a far more complex psychological mechanism. When a child grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment, their nervous system gradually learns to remain in a state of mild vigilance. Not always afraid, but always ready, like a delicate antenna, constantly scanning signals in the surrounding air. Over time, that antenna becomes incredibly sensitive. It can detect even the smallest changes in another person's emotional state. From the outside, people call this emotional sensitivity, but from the inside, it feels more like a long-standing habit. Always listening, always observing, always trying to understand what is happening inside others before tension begins to rise. Imagine a forest where deer must listen to every faint sound to avoid danger. Over time, their hearing becomes sharper than that of any other creature in the forest. That sensitivity helps them survive, but it also means they rarely truly relax. Many empaths grow up similarly. Their ability to feel emotional shifts becomes extremely refined, but that refinement develops in an atmosphere where vigilance is necessary. This is where the story becomes even more interesting. The ability to read emotions not only shapes how empaths see others, it gradually shapes how they see themselves. Over time, a quiet belief begins to form in the minds of many empaths. It is rarely spoken aloud, yet it becomes deeply rooted. My value lies in understanding others. If I can ease tension, if I can help people feel better, if I can keep the atmosphere peaceful, then I will be loved and allowed to stay in the relationship. This is a very subtle form of psychological adaptation. In Jungian psychology, the part of ourselves that we develop in order to fit into society is called the persona, the social mask. For many empaths, this mask becomes the image of the one who always understands, the good listener, the one who always forgives. Society praises this persona. Families admire it. It is often seen as a sign of emotional maturity. But Jung also reminded us that every persona has an opposite side, which he called the shadow. When someone constantly tries to be the peacemaker, the understanding one, the compassionate one, other emotions such as anger, disappointment, or the need for respect are often pushed into the darker regions of the psyche. They do not disappear. They are simply not allowed to appear. Understanding the origin of these patterns allows empaths to begin seeing themselves with greater kindness. Instead of blaming themselves for being too soft or too nice, they may realize that many of their behaviors are simply old survival mechanisms still operating in the present. And once the unconscious is brought into awareness, as Jung suggested, it no longer has to direct our lives silently. In the next part, we will explore a very subtle paradox in the psychology of empaths, one that can completely change how they view their relationships. Stay with us, because the story is only beginning to unfold. 2. When empaths confuse love with sacrifice. In the minds of many empaths, love often becomes closely connected with endurance. Forgiveness is seen as maturity, patience is seen as compassion, and staying, even when the heart is already tired, is often interpreted as loyalty to love. What makes this story complicated is that these values sound beautiful. No one wants to become cold. No one wants to think of themselves as lacking compassion. So, empaths continue forgiving, even when hurtful behavior repeats far more times than any heart should endure. Behind this compassion lies a story that is rarely examined directly. When we look more closely, we begin to see that many empaths unconsciously merge three different ideas into one. They confuse love with sacrifice, they confuse compassion with endurance, and they confuse forgiveness with morality. When these three ideas blend, leaving a relationship becomes almost impossible, because if they leave, they fear becoming selfish. If they stop forgiving, they fear they are no longer a good person. What many people do not realize is that this fear does not always come from the present. It often comes from deeper layers of the psyche. In analytical psychology, Carl Jung explained that people create a social image to be accepted, which he called the persona, the mask we wear in the world. For many empaths, this persona is the calm, understanding person who always sees things from another's perspective. It is often praised as wisdom or emotional maturity. But when the persona becomes too strong, other parts of the self can be pushed into the shadows. One example is Jane, who shared her story while trying to understand her own mind. For years, she believed she loved deeply and always tried to understand others. When her partner acted cold or emotionally manipulative, Jane did not question his behavior. Instead, she focused on understanding the pain he might be carrying. At first, forgiving made Jane feel generous, but the same patterns continued to repeat. When she described those moments, Jane said that sometimes a quiet anger would arise inside her, yet almost immediately she would silence it. She told herself that anger was a sign of immaturity and that real love required greater patience. What Jane did not yet realize was that this anger was not the enemy of love. It might have been a signal of dignity. From a Jungian perspective, Jane's story reveals a conflict between persona and shadow. Her persona was that of a calm and compassionate woman, but in her shadow, other emotions had begun to accumulate. Anger at being treated without respect, sadness at feeling unseen, and exhaustion from always playing the role of the understanding one. When such emotions are not acknowledged, they do not disappear. They simply sink deeper into the unconscious. As Jane began to observe herself more carefully, she noticed something unusual. Each time she forgave too quickly, she felt a strange emptiness inside, as if a part of her had been forgotten. She described it with a powerful image. A house where every door is open to welcome others, but there is no room reserved for the owner of the house. When Jane recognized this image, her understanding of love began to shift. She started to ask herself whether her endurance was truly love, because if love requires someone to continually ignore their own wounds, perhaps it is no longer love at all. Jung often emphasized that psychological maturity is not only about developing qualities that society praises. It is also about integrating the parts of ourselves that have been rejected. When an empath allows themselves to feel anger, disappointment, and the need for respect, they do not become less compassionate, they become more whole. This realization often leads to a change that others may not expect. When an empath begins to distinguish between love and sacrifice, they begin to see another truth as well. Endurance is not proof of love, and endless forgiveness is not a sign of maturity. Healthy love does not require a person to erase themselves to maintain a connection. It allows each person to keep their dignity, their boundaries, and their truth. If Jane's story helps you see yourself in a new way, stay with us, because in the next part, we will explore what truly happens when an empath stops forgiving everything for the first time. 3. When the empath stops forgiving, every mask falls. The turning point of an empath is rarely loud or dramatic. It often begins with a quiet realization, like suddenly stopping on a familiar road and recognizing that you have been walking in the wrong direction for a long time. For years, empaths forgive almost by reflex to keep the peace, preserve connection, and prove their compassion. But eventually, that reflex slows down, not because they become cold, but because they begin to hear a long-ignored voice within themselves. That quiet voice asks a simple but powerful question. How many times have I forgiven just to maintain a relationship that was never truly fair? From that moment, something begins to change. Memories surface, the times they silenced their truth to avoid conflict, apologized for things that were not their fault, or gave far more than they ever received. As these pieces come together, a clearer picture appears. When unconditional forgiveness stops, the masks within relationships begin to fall. Like fog lifting from a landscape, hidden patterns become visible. Manipulation can no longer hide behind empty apologies, and victim roles can no longer avoid responsibility. Relationships once called love begin to reveal how one-sided they may have truly been. These moments can leave empaths stunned, not because they are unintelligent, but because they have grown so accustomed to viewing everything through compassion. They have explained other people's behavior too many times. They have tried to understand the wounds of others so deeply that they forgot to ask who was trying to understand them. When the fog of unconscious forgiveness disappears, they see their relationships for the first time with a clarity that can feel almost painful. What is surprising is that the first mask to fall is often the empath's own. For many years, They carried the image of the one who was always calm, always forgiving, always the one holding everything together. This persona, as Carl Jung described it, is the social mask people build to fit the expectations of their environment. The empath's persona is beautiful, but when the persona becomes too strong, another part of the self can be pushed into the shadows. Jung offered a profound reflection on this. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. For empaths, that darker part may include emotions they once believed should not exist. Anger at being treated unfairly, bitterness when realizing they have been taken advantage of, and the feeling of betrayal when their trust is not honored. At this point, a difficult but important stage of the inner journey begins. When empaths begin to see their shadow, they often experience a complex wave of emotions: anger, sadness, shame, and even self-blame. One part of them may ask why they stayed so long. Another part may feel guilty for having such negative emotions at all. But in Jungian psychology, these emotions are not signs of collapse. They are signs of integration. The shadow is not the enemy of growth. It is the forgotten part of the self, asking to be seen. When empaths begin to acknowledge these emotions, they do not become less empathetic. In fact, they begin to become more whole. Their compassion no longer comes from self-denial, but from a deeper understanding of themselves. They start to realize that true forgiveness is not an unconditional reflex. Real forgiveness only has meaning when it does not require a person to sacrifice their dignity. Those who were once used to the empath always being compassionate may feel confused. Some people even react by saying that the empath has changed. This may sound painful, but it reveals an important truth. Many relationships feel comfortable only when the empath continues playing the role of the one who always forgives. When that role ends, the structure of the relationship begins to change as well. This is why this stage is often so painful. Empaths not only lose old illusions, but sometimes even relationships that have existed for many years. But from Jung's deeper perspective, this is not a collapse. It is the beginning of the individuation process, the process through which a person begins to live according to their true nature, instead of merely the roles they have grown accustomed to. And once the truth has been seen, another question begins to appear in the empath's mind. If I am no longer the one who always forgives, who will I become? This question is not a sign of being lost. It is the doorway to a new stage of the inner journey. 4. Signs of awakening and process of establishing boundaries. Empaths often live like an emotional sponge. They absorb the tension, sadness, and even anger of others, often trying to soothe feelings that were never theirs to carry. This ability once made them great listeners and natural mediators, but over time, it can also turn them into a place where others unconsciously unload emotions they have never processed themselves. When empaths begin to recognize this, an important shift takes place. Things that once seemed normal become easier to see. They notice that some people only come to them to release frustration, that many conversations revolve around others' problems, and that their constant understanding may have allowed unhealthy patterns in relationships to continue repeating. The first sign of awakening is a change in how empaths experience themselves. They begin to realize that they no longer want to carry every emotion in the room. They no longer feel responsible for fixing every conflict, explaining every behavior, or soothing every outburst of anger. At first, this feeling may seem unfamiliar, because for many years they were used to reacting immediately. But when that pause appears, they begin to understand that boundaries are not coldness. they are a form of self-awareness. From Carl Jung's perspective, psychological maturity often begins when a person dares to step away from the roles they have long been accustomed to. One of Jung's reflections is often remembered in this context. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. When empaths begin to look inward, instead of only observing the emotions of others, they start to realize a simple but powerful truth. They are not the place where all the emotions of the world must be stored. From that realization, several signs of awakening begin to appear in their lives. The second sign is that empaths stop pretending that everything is fine. In the past, they might have smiled to keep the peace, even while feeling hurt. But as awakening unfolds, they become more honest with themselves. This does not mean they become confrontational or argumentative. It simply means they no longer cover every situation with an artificial layer of calm. The third sign is that their ability to recognize manipulation becomes sharper. Things that once confused them begin to appear more clearly. Comments that create guilt without reason. Apologies followed by the repetition of the same behavior. Sudden bursts of affection after someone has behaved poorly. Empaths begin to recognize patterns such as guilt tripping or love bombing that they once mistook for sincerity. The biggest change is not simply that empaths recognize these toxic patterns, but how they respond to them. In the past, they might have tried harder to understand, forgiven more quickly, or adjusted themselves to maintain harmony. But as boundaries begin to form, their responses change. They can still listen and empathize, but they no longer take responsibility for other people's emotions or allow their kindness to be exploited. During this process, one emotion that was once misunderstood begins to appear more clearly: anger. In the past, many empaths feared anger because they believed it made them negative or unkind. But as psychological maturity develops, they begin to understand that anger is not always destructive. Sometimes it is a protective signal, showing that a boundary has just been crossed. At this stage, something interesting often happens. Unhealthy relationships begin to fade from an empath's life. This does not always happen through dramatic endings, but through the quiet disappearance of familiar interactions. When empaths stop acting as an emotional dumping ground, those who once depended on that role often reach out less. This path is not always easy. It requires courage to face old feelings of guilt and trust that boundaries do not destroy love. They protect it, and in the end, empaths realize they have not lost themselves. They have simply grown into a more mature version of who they truly are. Among the signs mentioned here, which ones do you recognize in yourself? Share them in the comments. Because your story might help someone else walking a similar path realize that they are not alone. 5. Forgiveness is not the moral duty of the empath. There is an idea that has become so deeply rooted in the minds of many empathic people that they rarely question it. It sounds beautiful, deeply moral, and is often repeated as if it were a universal truth. If you are mature enough, you will forgive. If you truly understand, you will let go. And if you are someone with an open heart, you will not hold on to anger for too long. For many years, these words have led empaths to believe that forgiveness is not merely a choice. It is almost their moral duty. But when we pause and look more carefully, another question begins to appear. Is immediate forgiveness truly a sign of maturity, or is it sometimes a very subtle way of avoiding the truth? When this question appears in an empath's mind, their understanding of forgiveness begins to change. Olivia's story illustrates this clearly. For years, she was always the first to forgive. When conflict arose, She tried to understand the other person's pain and believed that compassion would make the relationship healthier. But over time, she discovered a difficult truth. Her forgiveness rarely changed the other person's behavior. It only allowed the same cycle to continue. It is here that a very deep psychological truth begins to emerge. Hasty forgiveness is sometimes not healing at all. It can be a way of avoiding the wound itself. When an empath forgives too quickly, they often do it to keep everything calm. They fear that if they acknowledge their own pain, the relationship may collapse. They fear that if they question another person's behavior, they will be seen as difficult or lacking compassion. So they choose the more familiar path. They let go of their own feelings before those feelings are ever fully understood. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is a classic example of how people avoid the shadow side of the psyche. One of Jung's profound reflections makes this especially clear. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. This quote is often understood as a reminder to confront fear. But in the case of the empath, it can also apply to the way they face their own pain. Forgiving too quickly is sometimes a way of avoiding the need to look directly at pain, anger, or the feeling of betrayal. What is interesting is that the person urging you to forgive quickly is not always seeking true reconciliation. Olivia's story shows this clearly. After a major conflict with her husband, she chose to take time to understand her feelings instead of forgiving immediately. Instead of respecting that space, he insisted she was holding on to resentment for too long. At first, Olivia felt guilty, but later she realized that this pressure was not about healing the relationship. It was about avoiding responsibility and restoring the old balance of power. Through this experience, Olivia discovered an important truth. Real forgiveness cannot be forced. It is not a moral reflex we must perform to prove we are good. True forgiveness can only happen when the wound is acknowledged, boundaries are restored, and the heart is genuinely ready to let go. Without these, forgiveness is often just a layer of paint covering an unresolved crack. When Olivia allowed herself to slow down, something shifted. She realized that not forgiving immediately did not make her bitter. It simply helped her see more clearly what truly needed healing. From the perspective of depth psychology, this is the movement from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy. The empath does not lose their compassion. They simply stop using it to cover unresolved pain. They still have the capacity to understand the pain of others, but they also begin to understand that their own pain deserves respect. And it is exactly at this point that a very important realization begins to appear in the empath's journey. Respecting your own pace of healing is not selfishness. It is an expression of self-respect. Forgiving when the heart is ready is an act of liberation, but forgiving while the wound is still intact only keeps that wound hidden. When empaths understand this, they begin to see forgiveness no longer as a moral duty, but as a conscious choice. What is interesting is that when this shift happens, the way empaths view relationships begins to change as well, and from there, a new phase of the inner journey starts to unfold. 6. The journey of awakening always comes with sorrow and loss. The awakening process does not bring only clarity, it also comes with many losses. When an empath begins to see the truth about their relationships, they may feel relief in the first moments, as though a layer of fog has just lifted from the mind. But right after that, another feeling often appears, a deep sadness. Not because they were wrong to love, but because they begin to realize that not every love can be saved through sacrifice. This sadness does not come only from having to let go of certain people. but also from releasing the beliefs that once sustained them for many years. Many empaths once believed that if they were patient enough, understanding enough, and loving enough, they could help another person change. That hope kept them in many difficult relationships. But when awakening happens, they begin to see that love, no matter how sincere, cannot change someone who is not willing to change themselves. As that hope slowly fades, the empath must face another kind of loss, like a dream quietly disappearing when morning comes. They realize that some relationships existed only because of their sacrifice, and when that sacrifice stops, the structure of the relationship begins to tremble. This can make them feel as if they are losing a part of their life, not because they want to hold on at any cost, but because they once poured so much of their heart into it. And yet, not everyone leaves when the empath changes. Awakening often brings with it a process of reorganization in relationships. When empaths begin to establish boundaries and live more truthfully, the world around them also reacts in different ways. Some people leave rather quickly, especially those who had grown used to the empath always yielding. They may say that the empath has changed or is no longer as warm as before. These words can sometimes make empaths doubt themselves. But when they look more deeply, they realize that what is being lost is not real love, but an old role they once played in relationships. From another point of view, some people begin to respond in a completely different way. When empaths stop hiding behind sacrifice, they become clearer about who they truly are. And that clarity sometimes allows certain relationships to become healthier. Those who genuinely respect them begin to see them in a new light, no longer as the person who always carries everyone's emotions, but as a human being with boundaries and values of their own. Between these two opposite reactions, empaths often have to pass through a very difficult stage. It is the stage of loneliness. Not complete loneliness, but a temporary emptiness between two versions of life. Their old version was once defined by sacrifice. Their new version is gradually forming, but is not yet fully stable. During this period, empaths may feel as though they are standing between two worlds. They no longer want to return to the old way of living, but they are not yet fully familiar with the new path. In analytical psychology, Carl Jung described such phases as a necessary part of the individuation process. One of Jung's reflections is often remembered when speaking of inner transformation. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The awakening of consciousness rarely happens without a certain degree of pain, not because pain is the goal of the journey, but because it is often the sign that an old structure is dissolving to make space for something more authentic. In Greek mythology, the story of Persephone reflects this journey beautifully. She once lived in the bright garden of spring, but after descending into the underworld, she returned transformed, no longer the girl of eternal spring, but the goddess of both light and darkness. This mirrors the empath's awakening. Once living only in the spring of compassion, they eventually begin to see the darker truths within relationships. Though painful, this journey leads them toward wholeness. What many empaths realize afterward is something profound. Temporary loneliness is not a sign of failure. It is the price of honesty with oneself. As old illusions fall away, they begin to build relationships based on respect rather than sacrifice, and finally experience what it means to simply be themselves without needing to save anyone. 7. Becoming inner sovereignty. After all the masks have fallen, after the painful awakenings and the inevitable losses, the journey of an empath does not end in coldness. That is often their greatest fear. They fear that if they stop forgiving too much, if they stop sacrificing themselves to keep the peace, they will become closed off or bitter. But the truth is far deeper than that. The destination of this journey is not to close the heart, but to open an entirely new way of existing in the world. A state we may call inner sovereignty. Inner sovereignty is not about controlling others or withdrawing from the world. It is the ability to remain grounded within oneself, to listen to one's own emotions without letting the fear of rejection take over, and to love without proving one's worth through sacrifice. When empaths enter this state, they stop living to please everyone else. And in that moment, a deeper part of the self begins to return, not a new self, but the one that had been hidden for too long. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, this return is closely tied to the symbol of the divine child. Not innocence alone, but the deepest, most authentic and creative core of the person, untouched by social roles or outside expectations. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For many empaths, this journey feels like meeting a forgotten version of themselves, the self that existed before they learned to please, to overcarry, and to measure their worth by how much they could hold together for others. As those old roles begin to fall away, that truer self slowly reappears. In the past, they often loved from fear, fear of losing connection, fear of disappointing others, fear of being seen as selfish if they set boundaries. But when inner sovereignty begins to form, their love starts coming from a different source. No longer from the effort to be accepted, but from the sharing of an inner life that has become fuller. They do not stop loving, but they no longer use love to compensate for the emptiness within themselves. In the past, they often defined themselves by roles: the listener, the healer, the one who always understands. These roles are not wrong, but when they become the whole identity of a person, they can cause that person to forget the deeper essence underneath. As awakening unfolds, empaths begin to see that they are not only helpers to others, they are also human beings with needs, with boundaries, with a desire to be respected. This is exactly where Jung's concept of individuation becomes important. Individuation is not the process of becoming perfect. It is the process of integrating every part of the self, both light and shadow. When empaths begin to accept their anger as a protective signal, their sadness as part of the heart, and their need for respect as a natural right, they begin to become more whole. When this wholeness begins to appear, the relationships around them also start to change in very interesting ways. Relationships built on sacrifice often cannot survive for long in this new environment, but relationships built on respect now have the opportunity to deepen. Empaths no longer have to struggle to make people stay. The right people will remain because they value the empath's true self, not the role the empath once played. Something else also begins to appear in their lives: inner peace. The peace that comes from living honestly with oneself. They no longer need to control how others perceive them or carry every emotion around them. They only need to live as themselves. When an empath truly steps into inner sovereignty, a subtle change takes place that other people often notice before the empath does. They become quieter within, not because they feel less, but because they are no longer swept away by other people's emotions. They remain empathetic, still capable of feeling the pain of others very deeply. But this time, they stand firmly within themselves while doing so. They become like a mirror reflecting truth, rather than a sponge absorbing all the chaos around them. That is the true destination of this journey. not becoming cold, not abandoning compassion, but becoming a whole human being, someone who can love without losing themselves. The story of an empath is not the story of becoming hard or cold. It is the story of gradually returning to oneself. That journey may be painful, and it may be lonely for a time, but it also opens the door to something very profound: the right to live honestly with oneself. As Carl Jung's psychological vision suggests, true maturity does not lie in becoming perfect, but in daring to see the whole of who you are, both light and shadow. And when empaths no longer forgive unconsciously, they do not lose their compassion. They simply begin to offer love from an inner world shaped by boundaries and self-respect. If this video has touched your experience, write the phrase, "I choose my inner sovereignty," in the comments as a reminder that you have the right to keep yourself intact in every relationship. Do not forget to like, share this video with those who may need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so that together we can continue exploring these deep psychological journeys in future videos.